Massive thanks, Adam, for that very lavish introduction. It's a great pleasure to be moderating this panel today. I am Chinnan, Maclean Dikwal. I head KBR's energy transition practice based out of Leatherhead. The topic we have at hand today, really exciting. I think very topical in the context of everything that's happening in the UK today and, of course, around the world. So, as Adam has pointed out, digital roadmap for a decentralized energy system would be going into a lot of depth. Looking at today's energy systems, very centralized. What's the place for decentralized energy system? What's the place for solar and wind and everything intertwined into one? And what does the future look like? So we'll be going into a lot of detail, touching on some of those. And I'm so happy I've got an excellent panel here today. So without further ado, I will introduce them very quickly and we can go into it. So I'm joined today by Louise Hernandez. Louise is Head of Energy Commodities and Networks at E.ON. I've got Nigel Holmes as well, CEO of Scottish Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association, very critical. Carolyn Bragg, Head of Policy and Association of Decentralised Energy. I've got Laura Sandys, CBE, Non-Executive Director of SGN, and Energy Systems Catapult, and of course Tim Lord, who is Senior Fellow at the Net Zero Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. So without further ado, I think we're going to go into it. I'll be posing questions. Just so you know, there's a chat box in here. Please feel free to pose questions. We'll pick them up and we will throw them to the panel to answer. We have approximately 45 to 50 minutes of clear discussion today. And after that, about 10, 15 minutes for questions. So we'll pass it on. All right. So to get this started, I had a few questions that will just get us going. The first of those is around, what's the place of renewable energy in the future decentralized system? And if you don't mind, Nigel, I'm going to come to you first. What's the place of renewable energy systems? We'll think about wind, tidal, and solar in that context. Thanks. Nigel, you might be on mute, I think. Pardon me.
That's a great start, isn't it? Thank you. So when we talk about the future energy system, there are actually locations in the UK where we've got a window on the future. And one of those is the Orkney Islands. Why do I say that? Well, it's because for over 5 years now, the Orkney Islands have produced more renewable electricity on an annual basis than they need over the year. And they're now starting to find different ways of using this energy, increased electrification of transport, electrification of heat. And I think this also starts to point out some of the challenges we have with integrating high levels of renewable energy effectively into the energy system. So my point is, if you're not careful, you can actually start finding that you have to switch turbines off, or you don't get to use all of the solar energy when it's available. And the challenge for the future energy system is to look at some of the, I would suggest, lessons that are being learnt in locations like Orkney, other areas of Scotland as well, and try and understand how in developing the future energy system, you can actually start to integrate these very high peak power loads, often intermittent power loads, into an energy system where you're actually looking for the security of supply of energy into heat, power, transport, and industry. But you've got to match time and place. So the location of where the renewables are, much of it could be in the North Sea, for example, and the location of demand. It could be the southeast, it could be Wales, it could be anywhere across the UK. How do you actually manage this challenge between time and place and scale? And this is where the use of, in the future energy system, the use of hydrogen could be a key enabler in terms of giving us the flexibility of the capturing that energy, storing that energy as hydrogen at very large scale, much larger scale than we, for example, would store energy for pumped hydro at the moment, and then bringing that back into use in the various applications, in particular heat, industry, high temperature process heat, transport, especially in the heavy duty vehicles. It could be also marine and aviation applications, and also indeed for re-electrification. So the ability of hydrogen to be turned back into electricity, potentially using very large gas turbines, very similar to the ones we've used for many years, in a way that you can actually balance the grid when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. So that's my introduction in terms of how I see hydrogen playing a key part in the future energy system, and the important role of projects, quite small projects even, in places like Orkney, that show how you can start to integrate that and make best use of that resource.
Absolutely. That's really powerful. Thank you so much, Nigel. I was going to say, thinking about that, and I think you've laid it quite clearly, the very interconnected, system that you have. So you talked about hydrogen and also renewable energy and some energy storage, all intertwined into one. Carolyn, can I come to you just very quickly? The framework that Nigel has laid here, what do you think the opportunities are moving from a centralized energy system like we have today to a decentralized energy system? So what are the opportunities and the challenges?
Yes, so just perhaps to add to what has already been said, I think there's also a real role for demand side response, and that's important, I guess, when we think about the challenges and the opportunities going forward. What you might find in future is that as we have these peaks of renewable electricity, when it's very windy, for example, we have demand from industrial sites, for example, from EVs, from heat pumps, coming up to meet it, alongside storage and some parts of hydrogen. I think the real opportunities that come from this is that from a market design perspective, you have the opportunity to create a far more efficient system than we have at present. We could really be using, I think, market mechanisms much more strongly to try to bring forward the right mix of these technologies and the value of flexibility that we'll need to respond to enormous deployment of variable renewables that we'll see in future. On the customer side, I think as well, what we'll see is hopefully a more varied offering, particularly to consumers, where, for example, we have new retail tariffs that are more time of use. They change in terms of which hour you're at, that show the value of you charging your car at different points, or even actually moving to something like an energy as a service model, where you have a more B2B relationship between energy service providers and the market. That means that the consumer has to do very little, whilst also massively contributing to this transition. I guess I would say in terms of the challenges, they're quite broad. We're moving to a really different architecture set of markets than we have had previously, and I think I guess the biggest challenges that we see are the reform of the wholesale market and the other markets that we use to achieve security of supply to deal with a far more active demand side, as well as this enormous deployment of hydrogen storage and renewable electricity, a total change to the way in which data moves around the energy system. In many ways, we are slowly moving into the 21st century, but perhaps in some parts of the energy system, we're still not quite there. And that will obviously need to change quite considerably over the next few years.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Carolyn. That was very, very elaborate. I think key things I take away from that: market design. Mentioned about that, designing new markets, making them incredibly more efficient, and of course, energy as a service. New commercial models that we haven't seen before coming into the markets fair. So that's really exciting. Just a quick question, Laura. In terms of this, so that transition, from a centralized system today to a decentralized one, what pace and scale of investments do you see needed to accelerate that, to make it happen?
Well, to be frank, we need as much investment as possible, as quickly as possible, to deploy and to effectively decarbonize our energy system. I mean, if I could sort of not rephrase your question, although, because I'm not an investment expert, but actually to pick up a lot on what Caroline was saying, is we've got a decarb system which is very, very different from a fossil fuel system. And whether it's going to be totally decentralized, or hopefully and certainly inefficiently it would be centralized, it's actually going to be a bit of a mix of both. And I think there are some really key dynamics that are very, very exciting. But as Caroline says, this is a big change for the energy sector. So if we start with the consumer, which is what this system should be serving, we've got a very, very changing consumer opportunity here. I mean, firstly, we need to reflect all the system costs and give that value to consumers. If you think we're moving from 400 key players, talking about a centralised system, who all know each other's golf handicap, to 100 million actions and assets, if you consider every EV car can do two things, we need to have a very, very different system design. And so fundamentally, we need to look at it from, in some ways, decentralized sounds as if it's located somewhere, but actually it is a consumer-driven energy system that we really need. And if you look at the energy stability going forward of a decarbonised, decentralised system, the ESO itself is saying that the majority of their flexibility that they will require going forward towards the late 20s, early 30s, will all come from demand. So Caroline's point about demand side response is absolutely fundamental to the stability of the system and the functioning of the system. And you are not going to be able to manage 100 million actions and assets on the system if you do it in the current analog manner. It will have to be digitalized. It will have to develop and deliver in many ways what Caroline was talking to, and I've been talking about for a very long time, is energy as a service. It will have to be able to manage the complexity of these actions and assets. So we are by definition moving to a decentralized energy system, which is going to be driven by consumers. It will have to have some centralized overview, but in some ways one sees that overview as being the accident and emergency department rather than the day-to-day functioning of the system, which can be done at a much lower level. Just to conclude, we have a vision on the digitalization, and that is you end up in a system where you have prices to devices. So linking the whole energy system through interoperable data, and that's a very exciting vision.
Powerful. Thank you so much, Laura, for that. Tim, can I come to you if that's okay? So the same question there. I mean, Caroline and Laura have laid out, a future energy system which has to be cycled, if you like. So if you think about the demand, the demand side and the supply side, very much an intimate energy management system. How do you see that shaping up? And I go back to, I'm not sure if you can comment about the investment, pace and scale of investment that's required.
Yeah, sure, thanks. So first of all, I would strongly agree with what people have said so far, that we're going to have a very different energy system in future to the one that we've had in the past. And the exciting thing about that is when you look at the analysis, it shows that a system with a lot of renewables on it and a system with very high flexibility is actually the cheapest system in the long term. But there's a big caveat on that, which is that it's the cheapest system if you design the market right. And at the moment, the market is designed around centralized, dispatchable capacity with low capital cost and high running costs. And actually, the energy system that we need in the future is basically almost exactly the opposite of that, right? It's high capital cost, it's low running cost, it's non-dispatchable. And therefore, I very much agree with the point that we need to fundamentally rethink how we do our markets. So I was very involved in the EMR process that happened. It started about a decade ago. I think I was about the 10th person to join that team back at the end of 2010, which feels like a lifetime ago. But what we really did there was we left the system as it was and we put some layers on top of it. And I think the next phase is going to have to be about how do you actually fundamentally redesign the system as opposed to kind of adding another couple more layers of complexity to it. The second thing I'd say is that Laura makes a really important point, and she's talked about this a lot, in terms of the value that consumers can add to the system and how we enable them to access that value, which is a critically important point. The one thing I'd say is that one of the things that we don't talk about enough in that context collectively is how you do that in a fair an accessible way. Because one of the challenges here is going to be that if you have the ability to be flexible and you have the capital as a household or a consumer to be flexible, you're going to be more well placed to access that value. So to give a very quick example, if I'm reasonably wealthy and I have a driveway and I have an electric vehicle, I can probably charge it for 5 to 10 pence a kilowatt hour. And in future, I might even get paid for charging my vehicle through vehicle to grid charging. I'll charge it when the electricity is cheap and I'll sell it into the grid when it's expensive. So I'm getting paid to fill up my car. Whereas if I haven't got a driveway and I'm using the public charging network, I'm paying 25 pence a kilowatt hour to charge my car. And I think that's a fundamental problem. One example of what could be a more fundamental problem across the system is how you enable consumers to access the value that they can bring to the system and how you do that in a fair way.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Tim. Very, very helpful. I was going to say I'll dive deeper into the discussion, so start looking at particular systems here. So carbon capture and storage, for instance. If I just pose a question on that front, what technology frameworks do you see that would affect development funding? How do you see that shaping? There's several discussions in the public sphere today talking about CCS as a bit of a distraction. Is that the case? How do you see the development funding shaping on that front? Louise, can I pass that over to you, if that's okay?
Sure, you can definitely pass it on to me, but I have to say that I'm not an expert on this area. I work rather on storage technologies for the integration of renewables on medium and low voltage level, and carbon capture is a topic where I believe we all are waiting for that technology that in the end is definitely going to be cost effective and allow for us as a society to be able to extract carbon from our footprint. But if there's anyone else in the panel that knows more about it, happy to pass it on to that person.
Thoughts on that? I was going to say, can I just pass it and make this open? I'm sure you'd have thoughts on this. Anyone for that matter, around CCS. Have any thoughts? Yes, Nigel, please go for it.
So, on the face of it, if we go for a all renewable system, people might say we don't need carbon capture and storage. But I think what we're seeing now with climate change suggests two things. Firstly, we need to take rapid action to reduce carbon emissions, and that's where carbon capture storage does have a part to play, even if it's just temporary. And I think the other aspect, which was highlighted in the recent IPCC report, is the level of CO2 in the atmosphere. They're now saying we need to seriously consider ways of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. And one of the approaches that is starting to be looked at is direct air capture. So you're actually scrubbing CO2 out of the air and you're putting it in safe long-term storage assets. But to do that, you need energy. And again, this is an opportunity, I would suggest, for using renewable energy to actually drive the direct air capture and drive the processes of actually storing the CO2, to actually amplify the benefits from renewables, to actually reduce CO2 and not just to stop emissions. So in terms of the role of carbon capture and storage, I think increasingly people are recognizing it's got a key part to play in addressing the situation we're in at the moment.
That's fantastic. And actually, if I just make a comment here, because it's an interesting debate. If you think about where much of the investment is coming from, a lot of it comes from oil and gas companies, and there have been comments around greenwashing, very much so. But to your point there, about 100 billion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere is said to be in the need of being scrubbed out. So should that be where investment should go? Laura, can I bring you in? Pardon me, just my thoughts there.
Yes, I mean, I'm not a total expert on this, but I think CCUS throws up something very important, and that is that we do now need, we're doing this through the digitalization task force, we do now need to have very, very clear common carbon flow metrics right across the system, because currently we might account for things in different ways across the system. And it's going to be absolutely crucial to bottom out exactly what we're talking about through the CCUS process. So I really do believe that is a fundamental that needs to be underpinning this. And to be frank, the CCUS that we're looking at, the big stuff, that's all great as well. There is quite a lot of innovation going on in agriculture at the moment on carbon capture. There is some interesting work that's been going on in the chemical sector about carbon capture and reutilization. And so sometimes we just look at CCUS as mine is bigger than yours sort of situation, rather than actually microcarbon capture. I don't know how economic it is, but these are innovations we need to capture.
Tim, please go for it.
Yeah, so just 4 quick points I'd make on CCS. The first is you cannot get to net zero without it. So the people who say, we don't need CCS, it's a distraction. I don't agree with that. I haven't seen a net zero pathway for the UK that gets you to net zero without very significant amounts of CCS. There is a valid point that we shouldn't be distracted on it at the expense of all the other things that we need to do, but we do need to do it. The second issue on CCS is where is the right place to use it. All of these resources are finite to 2050. We can't just build infinite amounts of anything. So the extent to which the power system is the right place for CCS, I think, is a very open question. There may well be other parts of the energy system, including like air capture, including industry, where it's better placed. The third point is investment case, right? Why do we have a lot of renewables in the UK? Because there is an investable instrument to go and build renewables. When we look at all the other technologies we need for net zero, whether it's storage, whether it's heat pumps, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's CCS, we don't have those investment cases at the moment. And that is absolutely critical. If people can't see a sensible return for them in doing these things, they're probably not going to do it. And the fourth point is, I think you said about the oil and gas sector and CCS, my view would be the oil and gas sector has moved incredibly slowly on CCS. If we look at the amount of investment that sector's made in oil and gas extraction over the last decade versus CCS, I reckon you'd probably be about 100 to 1 at a guess, or if someone has better data than that, then they can feel free to share that. I think the oil and gas sector has to move much more quickly on this. CCS, without CCS and without CCS in the next 5 to 10 years in major economies like the UK, there is a big existential challenge as opposed to a transition challenge for that sector. And I think they need to move much more quickly in the way some of the big renewables operators moved a decade ago, and look at the progress we've made in somewhere like offshore wind over that time because of genuine commitment both to volume and to pace.
Yeah, that's massively helpful. Massively helpful. I lean to your point there. There's no single case I've seen scenarios to reach net zero in terms of a pathway without CCS. So quite important. And I think the counterpart to that, I suppose, is the question around new markets. Because ultimately, because of the scale of the problem, potentially new markets, new opportunities are opening up. Laura mentioned that point around utilizing CO2 in other value chains. How do you take that and pass it into other systems, that could become profitable perhaps, or even monetized? So on that front, can I just ask a question here? How do you think applying technology could reduce waste across the value chain? And I ask that not just in the context of CO2, utilizing that, but, broadly, what's the place of innovation and technology deployment in reducing waste overall, heat, waste streams? I'll pass that open. Feel free to respond to it.
Well, I guess maybe if I start, a proven technology we have already is something called combined heat and power, which is a way of effectively using the heat from electricity generation. There's lots of configurations, but that's one. I think there's a real need, I think, to continue to invest in that, particularly as we move into hydrogen and biomass that are going to be scarcer probably than the natural gas resources we've had so far. And particularly for things like, for example, if you've got a heavy industry that you are trying to decarbonise in a way that doesn't put you at a competitive disadvantage internationally, you need to find a way to get that steam baseload at quite at a fair cost. And doing that in a very efficient way is probably the best way forward. So, it was great to see in the hydrogen strategy a clear role for CHP and fuel switching going forward. But I think that's a clear way that we could actually be pushing efficiency harder in the system.
Any other thoughts on this subject?
If I could add a thought here, so when we talk about waste, often we're looking at a process, and Carolyn's rightly picked up the waste of heat. I think in the renewable energy system going forward, the aspect that I think could be the largest waste if we don't do it right is the amount of curtailed generation. So we're already starting to see, there are times, where wind can be curtailed very significantly in the UK. I'm less sure about solar because I think much of that is embedded, so it's actually not quite so clear if that happens. But going forward, if you get to a situation where you've got a very large fleet of wind, a very large fleet of solar, if you're not actually capturing that energy when you produce it, it doesn't sit there in the yard. It's not like a coal power station where the coal sits in a pile. It's gone. So I think one of the biggest wastes that we're not careful could be the waste of renewable resources by not capturing, using them effectively.
I think that's interesting, if I may just to add in, I think to Tim's point as well, that does get you to quite a fundamental point that we're going to have to resolve in the next few years, because we need a really massive deployment of these technologies with an investment case that people can invest against, but we also need them to be in some ways exposed to volatile prices that are demonstrating the value of their electricity or their heat generation, or on the other side, that demand. And I think that's really difficult. At the minute, the government is quite focused on providing an investment case that in many ways works by shielding them from those volatile price signals, and is really dampening the market for flexibility that you'll need to do this cost effectively. So I think finding a better way to do this is one of the really big challenges we've got.
Caroline, that's a quite an interesting point. Actually, I didn't think about it that way. So, looking at market instruments that the government are putting forward, CFDs and import taxes in some way, as inhibitors actually to innovation. That's rather interesting. But can I just make the comment here, and just to get some of the discussion going as well? The EU strategy, as we see it, has as a first step sort of energy efficiency at the core of it. So if you had an asset here in the UK or in the EU, the first thing that's been pushed is energy efficiency. How can you optimize to make sure that all your furnaces and your turbines are running optimally? Step one, and I think they argue about 15% energy savings can come out of that, or 15% carbon abatement. And then beyond that, you have electrification. I think Nigel mentioned some of that. And then beyond that, you have other solutions that come in. In the context of that circularity, so thinking about waste as energy, like Nigel mentioned, and waste as material, I'm just wondering what sort of innovation, what kind of innovation or market system, so innovation, market forces as well, do we need to bring in to spur change? Laura, did you have any thoughts? Sorry.
Yeah, I did, and it sort of picks up from what Tim and Caroline and Nigel were saying. And there is a huge amount of waste in the system, because it's not been designed to be, in some ways, to have the pressure that other sectors. So in the food sector, there is quite a lot of food waste, but actually the big, the supply chain pressures have actually really created an unbelievably efficient system, because there's been a key player that has been driving through that supply chain. The problem with the energy sector, and Nigel point about constrained energy, actually a bit criminal, because if consumers knew how much was being paid for people to chuck stuff away, I think they would be pretty appalled by it. So if you don't have that price pressure that actually goes into the sector and starts to optimize it, we have a problem. Everything is a pass-through cost. And as a result, we have none of those pressures. And coming back to what Caroline was saying, if you look at it from a consumer's perspective, all the waste and all the cost is passed on to me as a consumer through this whole system. The first layer of waste is how we consume it, and that is our leaky homes, our inefficient equipment, and in many ways, again, it talks to the title of a debate, which is decentralisation. It is a distributed challenge, and governments, and Tim can correct me here, governments and businesses in the energy sector find it much more difficult to act in a distributed way than a top-down centralised way. So we need the leaky homes, the efficient processes. We need people to be penalised for waste and not rewarded for it. And that then unlocks all these other exciting things, whether it be hydrogen storage or demand-side response.
And if I can I think just to add on that, on the heat side, that's even more important. Not even more important, but you get into that debate very quickly. For example, we have some really amazing innovation schemes going on at the minute to look at how you access waste heat that we've never really accessed before for the purposes of heat networks, which are basically, they're a bit like having a central heating system, but for your town or your city. You know, it's a system of pipes flowing hot water. But we have people in London, they're taking waste heat from the tube to heat people's homes. We have SSE who are actually looking at, they're making use of National Grid's transformers and the heat that's produced by moving electricity between voltages to power your home, to heat your home. And there are loads of these sources of waste heat that we've never really looked at before because we've just had an enormous natural gas network. But the pressures to decarbonise mean that actually those sources of waste heat are going to be extremely valuable in future.
Absolutely. So yeah, thank you so much. That's really, really helpful. Can I just move us on actually into the next question, if that's okay? Thinking about the collaboration between energy systems or energy networks like we have them today, and the big demand centers, from transportation and also from home heating and all of that. How do you marry those together in a decentralized energy network? So think about the massive demand that we have, in terms of heating systems. Heating systems in the UK account for 75% of carbon emissions. Transportation, also a very, substantial number. How does that work in the context of a decentralized energy system? Caroline, okay, Nigel,
take
can you
it
go
to start with, and then people can jump in. I guess the real opportunity here is that the electrification of transport and quite a lot of heat provides you a great deal of flexible assets that perhaps you didn't have before. It's not that your gas boiler is responding very quickly over the day, but a heat pump, given the right model and the right incentives, certainly can. And EVs could play a really important part in how we manage the system, all the way from making sure that over a day or over a couple of days you've got enough that meets supply and generation and demand. But also EVs can go right up to the Y. You could be using portfolios of EVs to balance the system almost on a second by second basis, which is going to be really valuable in future. I think what you see is that, and as Laura's done loads of work on, what you start to get is this kind of a need to bring those signals down to a much more local level. At the minute, what we have is signals for flexibility that are telling the system what to do in terms of balancing generation and demand that really sit at a national level only, for the most part, and that's where all the information is as well. There's actually, I think people are surprised when they first get into the energy system quite how little data and signals we have at distribution at the minute. It's quite surprising, but there is very little there. And what you see is that if we're going to do this cost effectively, the need for quite local signals from the networks, from system operators operating quite locally, to be pushing those signals to an EV charger or portfolio or to heat pumps becomes more and more important.
I totally agree with Caroline. I think, it is about us turning the whole system upside down. And that doesn't mean to say that we won't need central systems to support that decentralized approach to energy. But it is that it needs to start with that customer. And that customer does have this value that we've all collectively worked on establishing. And for example, every EV van every year could deliver £500 value to the grid. Now, none of that is actually reported in any way. And so there is no mechanism by which these smaller assets as Caroline says, aggregated effectively, can actually participate. And what I feel very strongly, which I said right at the beginning, is we are trying to squeeze a totally different decarbonised system into a fossil fuel model. And Tim also mentioned this. And we're going to end up with the worst of all worlds, because we're going to cost us hugely for our decarbonisation and not deliver what I think is very exciting, which I call the decarbonisation dividend, where actually your car is reduced in cost because you can play on the grid. Your heat and your lighting is actually rewarded because it isn't utilising big national assets. It might need them from top-ups, it might need them at certain times, but everything, you look at other sectors, they're digitalised, they've got sophisticated business models, and data, I don't know where my data is coming from. Is it coming from a central data centre, a local data cache, or my computer? I don't know. I don't care. But it happens, and it is optimised because the price mechanisms are pushing the companies to do all the heavy lifting for me.
That's interesting, Laura. I think that's quite an interesting viewpoint, actually. In thinking about that, I suppose one of the things is on my mind is, in a decentralized energy system, do we almost need smart systems in every network, if you like, maybe homes, maybe in schools? Is that what that's going to look like? And you mentioned data. The data processing, what kind of framework are we talking about here? Would they be open data systems? What does that look like, I suppose?
I mean, I'll then be quiet, I promise. I mean, on the point is, everything in our lives is digitalised now, except for, not quite only except for energy, but almost except for energy. It's not that we need new frameworks. What we need to do is to adopt frameworks from other sectors who've been down this journey, who've worked through a lot of the consumer consent issues. The other country I would really point everyone to look at is Estonia, that has got the most sophisticated data consent and data management in the energy sector. It's super exciting. So I don't think we need to reinvent things. We need to learn from others.
Perfect. Tim, Nigel, any thoughts? Tim, you might be on mute.
Point around.
Yeah.
Sorry, someone was.
No, good now.
Just to come in on a couple of the points. The first is about the incentives are not good enough, and that's right. The incentive at the moment, in particular in the transmission distribution network, is just to build more stuff, because that's what we've always done to deal with these problems, as opposed to use the asset more efficiently. And we need to change those signals. The one plea I'd make is we mustn't forget about the politics here, because the challenge, I should say, with more local and spikier and sharper incentives and signals is that will have different impacts in different places, and people care about that a lot. There was a survey last week on the NHS about what people want from their GPs, and the thing that people want most from their GP is to know that they're getting the same service as everyone else in the country gets, more than anything else. And I think that's a general attitude that probably is transferable into energy as well. When you look at our system now, it is incredibly uniform, right? 85% of us get our heat in exactly the same way. Our boilers might be a bit less or a bit more efficient, but basically we all have the same system, right? So we all don't like it. We all know that energy is a very political issue. We've been reminded of that in the last couple of weeks. But the system that we're moving to is one where everyone's different, right? And that's good, because decentralisation means more efficient. It can be better for consumers. But how you manage the politics, in particular, not necessarily in the end state, but in the transition phase, I think that's the really hard bit. And I think we collectively as a sector, I think we need to think a lot harder about how we do that. I would emphasize I don't have the answer to how we do that, but there's a lot of smart people working in energy, and I think the more we need to spend a bit less time perhaps thinking only about the technology side, and a bit more time thinking about the politics and helping politicians to manage that process.
Yeah.
So I'd like to actually pick up, Tim, on some of your comments there. You mentioned earlier about the potential for the burden of the transition to weigh more heavily on those who are already disadvantaged, and that can be from either where you are at the moment in terms of your income or your accessibility to the technology, or actually sometimes where you're located. And I mentioned earlier the example of Orkney being essentially ahead of the curve and with a very high level of renewable generation, which is absolutely the case. But there's a flip side. It's Orkney, very north of Scotland. It's wet and it's windy. The average household income is not very high. And if you start to apply normal metrics around fuel poverty, you find actually that Orkney Islands have got one of the, if not the worst level of fuel poverty in the whole of the UK. And that's by either the normal definition or the extreme definition. Coupled with that, they don't have access to mains gas, which is normally the cheapest form of energy for heating homes. And typically the cost of electricity in Orkney is higher than the rest of the UK. So you've got essentially a triple whammy. So in making this change towards a greener and a better energy system, I think we need to just reflect very carefully on as Tim has pointed out, where could there be unintended consequences and where could there be. And coming back to this question around where we go with the whole energy system and the role of the networks. One of the reports that the Scottish Government put out a couple of years ago, or it's more than a report, a vision, the Energy Networks Vision 2030. So, Scotland, last year pretty much achieved 100% renewable electricity based on production over the year and demand over the year. But it also recognises that going forward, getting that balance right is going to be very challenging. And the Energy Networks Vision was about integrating the way you use the electricity and the gas networks in a way that you actually achieved that transition towards low carbon at the lowest possible cost to the consumer. So again, this was recognising that electrification plays a key part, but there is also a major for decarbonised gas networks to play in achieving that outcome.
I think that's quite interesting, though, in terms of Tim's point as well, though, because what you're moving from is a national gas system to one that's a bit more disintegrated. So between, say, for example, dedicated hydrogen networks, heat networks, as well as the electrification of heat in many areas. And I think I would very much agree with Tim. I think particularly when you look at government policy, there's a real tendency at the minute to look at what does the electricity system need? How do we recover the costs of what we need to do to transition the electricity system? What do we need to introduce in terms of hydrogen? How do we recover that within that system? Same with heat networks. And I think increasingly what you'll find is that there's a need that we understand how to kind of level that if there are these big regional differences, particularly in kind of these sunk non-commodity costs that start to appear.
And the one point I would add, Caroline, is that I think last year about 40% of the UK electricity generation came from gas. And that is the flexible aspect of power generation.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nigel. And I was going to say on that point of flexibility, actually, it has been an absolutely wonderful discussion. Thank you so much to the entire panel for, great thoughts and insights into, key aspects of decentralization as the world makes that transition from a centralized system to a decentralized one. I took away quite a few notes, frankly. You talked about the flexible system, an agile one that's real time, very much so driven by data, in a very, very centralized way. CCS we spoke about, and I think general thoughts and consensus is that CCS is required in almost every scenario that we have, towards net zero. Market incentives, from the government, we touched on that, talking about the fact that more needs to be done, perhaps something more innovative, if you like. The Estonia model, for data and all. So I think lots of, great insights have come out of this discussion. And I just thought I wanted to take the time to say a massive thanks for the whole panel. I'm going to pass it on to Laura shortly because we have a few questions coming through from the audience here. So Laura, if I pass it on to you, a very massive thanks to the audience as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Chinnan, and great to have you with us and in some ways sort of coordinating and conducting this fun orchestra here. I just wanted to kick off with one key sort of point and question, and that was how do we get, we all have a strong vision for a decentralized, I mean, from different perspectives, for a decentralized energy system. How do we get there, and how do we give confidence to policymakers and, you know, Tim's point about the politics of something that isn't quite as command and control? And it's about losing that command and control that sort of strikes me as being some of the problems that both policymakers and regulators start to retract from every time there's a great decentralised vision. Tim, what do you think about the challenge out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, we should a note of caution on decentralisation in the sense that, you know, we are going to need a lot of big centralised stuff in this system as well. And I know you weren't suggesting that we don't, but we need to remember that point as well. And the second thing is, as you say, there is a tendency, and there has been a tendency in the last decade, probably in particular, for more centralisation of energy system decisions. You've kind of seen in the last few weeks part of the reason why that's the case, which is that when things go wrong, it's a very centralised model, right? It's quasi-Kwarteng. It's the Prime Minister even who those problems come to. So the challenge, I think, is about how do you get politicians who in the end are on the hook for this stuff to let go of some of it. And for me, that's around how can you be clear on the kind of outcomes that you want to deliver. We tend to think, and actually, you know, I've been as guilty as anyone in this discussion today, about technologies. We think about, you know, nuclear and CCS and renewables and batteries and so on and so forth. We need to think much more in terms of the kind of outcomes of the system that we want to deliver. And we know what some of those are around flexibility and so on. How we can design the system around those, and how we can ideally incentivize the market to bring forward the best solutions, while recognizing that government will have a role, in particular on some of the biggest investment decisions. You're not going to get the market to fund a new nuclear power station without the government doing some pretty heavy lifting. But a lot of the stuff that happens downstream and closer to the consumer actually is ripe for innovation and ripe for the government to frankly get out of the way. So my personal view is, you know, having been through EMR, which I think did a lot of really good things, but not perfectly, is that what government and Ofgem should be looking at now, and, you know, every crisis also creates, you know, an opportunity for reflection and lessons learned, is to start that process of how are we going to fundamentally reform our market, not simply add layers of complexity to it. Because I don't think we'll be sat here in 2040 looking back and thinking, I'm glad we didn't undertake market reform in the early 2020s. We'll be thinking we should have done, or we'll be thinking that we're glad we did. So that I think the sooner we start that conversation properly and led by government and Ofgem, the better.
No, I totally agree. I think we're probably all agreed here. But Nigel, looking at your sort of particular interests, in some ways, one of the other problems, the barriers that we have in the energy sector is that people want silver bullets. And actually, it feels that there is going to be a huge amount of blended solutions, which actually aren't very well designed centrally, but could be delivered and developed by markets. And hydrogen is part of what I would call the refrigeration energy, and it's got a huge opportunity there. How do you see, in many ways, moving forward on these localized solutions with government and policy?
So the thing I'd like to say is that, yes, people do see hydrogen as a silver bullet. You know, there's all of the stuff that was in the 20% hard to treat, you know, box. High temperature industry heats, heavy goods vehicles driving up and down motorways, marine, aviation, you know, all of these, you know, people now say, yeah, hydrogen. And, you know, that's great. You know, I think there are definitely areas where hydrogen can be a key part of the solution. But I also recognise that, you know, there are other solutions out there, and it's a question of actually finding the best solution, or a solution that works for the consumer, and not just, you know, the silver bullet that fixes everything. And I think the danger with the silver bullet approach is that often it gets translated into policy, and policy then says, yeah, this is the solution, that we need to use. And that can be dangerous as well, because I think there are elements that could come through which we haven't yet fully teased out. It's not quite the unknown unknowns, but we just need to be wary that we put all of the eggs in one basket, and don't actually keep a fairly broad approach to doing this. But coming back to your key question about decentralized energy, I think one of the aspects that I think is important is to learn from locations where they do rely on decentralized energy for their heating, their transport, and the Scottish Islands are actually a fantastic example of where you have to make sure all of this works properly. And I think many of the approaches being developed. So, for example, in Orkney, active network management is now being used routinely to help to increase the amount of renewables that's getting onto the grid. And much of this, I think, as you've said already, is around how you use digital to actually collect the data, allow the right decisions to be made at the right time. But then behind it all, you need the right approach in terms of either the codes, the standards, the regulations that allow you to do that. And some of this can absolutely be deployed more widely. And in fact, Scottish and Southern are doing it in Orkney, and Scottish Power have been doing similar in the centre of Scotland. And these approaches are absolutely what we need if we're going to make progress. And that's actually fairly straightforward. That's within one network, one energy system. I think the bit that possibly gets more tricky, and Caroline, you mentioned this earlier, was about the opportunity with waste heat. All I would say is that with waste heat, the theory is fairly straightforward. You've got a source of waste heat, you've got a potential user. In practice, some of the issues very much around agreements, how you actually get the pipes in place. So it can be done, but don't expect it to come on a plate. Each project is different. Each project takes a lot of work to make it happen.
I think just to add to your point, I think there's something interesting about, as you say, some of the islands and where they're going. I mean, as you say, we've had active network management, but indeed we would argue that active network management schemes are a way of curtailing renewables without due compensation. In some respects, it does get renewables on the system quicker, but the curtailment is often open-ended, and I think actually in Orkney you're looking at wind farms that can be curtailed up to 50%, right, in some circumstances. I think what's moving forward that I find really interesting, and I think it's in Orkney, is the Electron project that's just delivering initial findings, that's looking at a decentralized sort of marketplace actually, so that demand can be incentivized to turn up when there's excess renewables on the island, so that you don't have to curtail as much through those A&M schemes. And I think that's a really interesting question, because that is something that's taken place outside of the DNOs and the networks and the kind of institutions that we've had so far. It's something that's enabled by the DNOs, but not something that's controlled by them. And that might well be a model that we need in future to really get this stuff going.
Can I add a question to you, Caroline? In some ways, we might not have the right players in the sector to really deliver a properly decentralized system. And I just wrote to that, do we have the right businesses that are consumer facing, looking at IDNOs, but possibly, importantly, for your decentralized location sort of approach, which is where we see it going. And maybe this is for Tim as well, is really localities need more power and need more money, don't they, to design, to shape, to utilise and optimise. Your experience of working with local authorities, etc., I think is really important.
I think so, definitely. I mean, you can see that there's really good innovation happening in some local authorities at the minute, and where they're resourced, I think they can make a big difference. We would certainly see a really strong role for the local authorities, particularly in local area energy planning, as a way of starting to map out the most effective heat decarbonisation path, for example. But you're right to say that in many ways, they're not resourced up to really achieve many of the roles that we're putting on them at the minute. If you look at, for example, enforcement of minimum energy efficiency standards, that you'd see as one of the kind of the minimums that we need, right? The funding, isn't there really to have a consistent approach across the UK. But I think we need to balance what their role is with what local markets can bring forward too.
No,
if I can
absolutely.
just add on the role of local authorities and city authorities in this, absolutely key. Many of the early hydrogen demonstrator projects, in fact, probably all of them, been with local authority partners. Western Isles, Orkney, Aberdeen, Fife, and now Glasgow, all starting to deploy. And one of the key aspects here is we talk about we've talked a lot about the heat and the power, and some of the power going into transport. I think, again, one of the key aspects for cities now is not just decarbonisation. It's increasingly a focus on the air quality within cities, much of which is linked to transport. And to actually achieve the levels of improvement that are needed in many cities. And in fact, the World Health Organization last week actually came out with a report saying that particulate matter, PM2.5, which is currently 20 micrograms, they're thinking about bringing that down to 5 micrograms. So a massive reduction. Why? Because it's not good for you. And we need to actually think again about this aspect of the whole energy system. When we're looking at decarbonisation, we're rightly looking at the global benefits of reducing carbon emissions. But there is a second benefit, which is also critical in many areas. It's about the health benefit from decarbonising transport and getting away from the burning of fossil fuels in locations where it can have adverse health impacts. And locations like Glasgow, absolutely, are looking at decarbonisation of public transport, buses, electric and hydrogen, as a way of achieving that. And again, this, I think, can also be a way where the benefits from decarbonisation can go out to a wider spread of people. So it's not just the people who can afford the electric cars that get the benefits. The right kind of public transport will give benefits to everybody.
No, I'm really keen on, Tim.
So just to add, Laura, I think your question had kind of two parts. One on do we have the right businesses, and the second on the role of local areas. I think on the first one, we haven't had the right businesses in this sector and the right business models in this sector to deliver the kind of transition that we need to. The one thing I'd say on that is there's going to be a real push, I think, in light of what's happened in the last few weeks, that the lesson learned from that is that we need to increase barriers to entry into energy in general, because we've had the barriers of entry too low. We've had some people coming in who weren't sufficiently hedged, weren't sufficiently capitalised. That's what's causing the problem. And we certainly do need to learn those lessons. And to some degree, that is the case, I think, for some of the companies that have struggled in the last few weeks. But we need to be really careful not to learn the lesson that what that means is we kind of retrench to the system of 10 years ago in terms of the kinds of business models that we're encouraging in the sector. I think on the point about local areas, I mean, absolutely. Central government does tend to think of these things in silos. Right? You think about heat, and you think about power, and you think about transport, and you think about industry, and how do we decarbonise each of those? The challenge, of course, is that kind of worked actually for a while, particularly when the main thing you were decarbonising was power. But the next phase is not like that, as we all know. And when we think about transport, of course, where I live in South East London is going to have very different transport solutions to the Orkney Islands. Of course it would, but in energy, we don't tend to think in that way to quite the same extent. I mean, the two things we need to worry about from that point of view, one is about kind of data about local energy systems in terms of A, how they work, and B, how they might work in the future. Because we all sort of say, well, there's going to be different heating solutions in different parts of the country, but no one's got a map that kind of shows us what might work where, so we can actually start properly answering those questions that, if you live 30 yards from the end of a heat network, you probably shouldn't get a heat pump. But at the moment, you might not even know it. So we need to fix that. And then the second point is about the kind of institutional capability, where I agree there are some local authorities and some arms of local government which have real capability and ambition and willing here, but that is very, very variable. I mentioned postcode lotteries earlier. That is a real postcode lottery, and it isn't necessarily their fault because they've got a huge amount of things to do, and their voters are not necessarily asking about this as top of the list. So how does central government help to provide that capability and to devolve some of that capability down is probably one of the really big challenges here.
I mean, in some ways, what it does is throw up another exciting problem. And that's the exciting problem of both local government and different departments of government working together, which is one of those amusing little quandaries. We've had a few questions, and maybe if you'd like to choose the questions that you feel you'd like to answer best. Are virtual power plants a reality or an ideology? Collaboration, sharing and cross-industry effort is going to be key to achieve the transition. Do the panel see the need to further mechanise for wider collaboration, even outside energy? Well, I'd like to answer that one. And last minute views on new technologies coming through that might be drivers for change or transformation. So, Nigel, can I start with you? You go. No, Caroline, you go.
Well, I'll take the VPP one at one point,
yes.
But whenever we're ready. No,
go for it, Caroline.
Oh, so virtual power plants are definitely a reality. So it's a grand name, but all it means is that you're aggregating a number of different sources of flexible demand and maybe some storage, maybe little bits of generation. You might have, an industrial sites on-site CHP as part of that, and then you aggregate that up into a larger amount of capacity. So maybe you've got a megawatt by that point, maybe you've got 2, and then you're putting that into a market. So that might be providing, for example, flexibility services at a national level to the electricity system operator. That might actually, very recently, we've managed to reform slightly the balancing mechanism, which is the one that it kind of makes sure that generation and demand are equal on a sort of half-hourly by half-hourly basis. And there are virtual power plants now getting involved in the balancing mechanism, and hopefully in the future we'll see that in the wholesale market. We'll see that in local flexibility markets. Certainly not an ideology. It's with you right now.
Exactly, Nigel. You want to choose one of those questions?
Well, I think just to add on the discussion around virtual power plants. So much of the focus has been on hydrogen as a way of decarbonisation. What I'd like to also bring in is the role of fuel cells. So fuel cells can be used to produce electricity from hydrogen, and it's true zero emission. And that can be used either in transport applications or stationary applications. And in the transport applications, the real benefit is the ability to actually store a lot of energy in the hydrogen tank and then to turn that into electricity on demand. And Toyota, with their Mirai hydrogen fuel cell car, have actually done a number of demonstrations of how that the fuel cell car can essentially just be hooked up and used as a mobile generator, powering performances, outside performances, events. And why does that matter? Well, again, it comes back to what I was saying just now about keeping the balance between carbon emissions and air quality. What potentially the fuel cells allow you to do is to put generation right into the middle of a city, into people's houses, into their driveways, with no issues around air quality being generated whatsoever. And in fact, in some cases, the claims have been that the air that comes out of the fuel cell is actually cleaner than the air that went in. But pick that one for another day. But it's about getting the right type of technology in the right place at the right time, using the right fuel.
And Tim.
Yeah, I think just on the new technologies point, because obviously new technology is vital to this transition. We've seen incredible innovation in the last 10 years. I mean, if I think of the EV market, if you said to someone 10 years ago, do you want an EV? They'd have said no, because they look like Duplo toys, right? And now they're one of the most desirable consumer products you can imagine. Now, whether you can do that with heat pumps is another question, but you can see those kinds of innovations making a huge difference to this transition. The only note of caution I'd add, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here, is that the technologies we need to do this transition exist, and we've got 30 years to do it. So the kind of, I read an article about nuclear fusion coming to the rescue at the weekend, which kind of amused me, because I remember watching Blue Peter when I was about 10 in the 80s, and they had a thing about nuclear fusion and how it was going to come to the rescue then as well, and we haven't moved on a huge amount since. So the one thing I'd say about new technologies is that we have a lot of it already, and it's about deployment and refinement as we deploy, rather than waiting for something to come along that's going to be a game changer. But I know that the people on this call will I'm sure, know all that already.
No, I absolutely agree, and I think there is a lot of sort of both silver bullet type mentality and sort of moonshots, when actually we've got all the tools, and some of them are very old-fashioned. I mean, a heat pump really is an air conditioning unit, isn't it, in many ways? And it could look a lot nicer. So I think we need to get out of the sector a lot more and meet interior designers. And why do you choose an Apple phone rather than a Samsung? It's less functioning, it's more expensive, but my word, it looks nicer. And so this is a whole mentality change that I think needs to happen. And maybe I'm answering these questions a bit myself, I hope you don't mind, but we need new types of people who actually understand how to sell consumer goods, who know that consumer preferences are about taste as much as they are about certain key areas. Sorry, Nigel.
Thank you. Just to pick up on some of the comments around, for example, the timescales we've got and the idea of moonshots. And although net zero for the UK is 2050, we have not got 30 years to actually take the actions that we need in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change. That was the very clear message from the IPCC report just about a month ago. And I think what we need to be careful of is that net zero, because it's a long way off, people agree, yes, that's what we can do, but we don't actually take the steps now that we need to actually make that progress. And in many cases, it's a question of not waiting for the perfect. Don't let the perfect get in the way of doing what we can do now. And to do with moonshots, the US has actually started to put a hydrogen moonshot in place. And what they're doing is taking some of the approaches they used for the space program and saying, can we use this now to start to identify the technology, the scale up, the commercialization that will help us to deliver the rapid progress that we now need. So they've set targets for 2030 for...
Nigel.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go on. No, I think we're just sort of... Don't mean to interrupt you. Continue, but we've got 1 minute.
Right. So the US targets are very much about getting stuff done by 2030. There's mission innovation doing the same. So I think there's useful programs in place that we can actually take part in, but this is international, not just the UK.
So I think we all believe we need to move quickly. I also believe that, we've got absolutely the right technologies. We haven't got the business models. We haven't got the regulation. We need new sort of policy as well to actually drive this forward. I wanted to leave everyone with one thought, and that's about refrigeration. And if you think of the food sector and how it was transformed by refrigeration, and refrigeration comes in all sizes, frozen food, flash freezing, chillers, but most importantly, the fridge in your home. And that is the decentralized storage mechanism for the energy sector, where we have all of this capture of energy, we reduce waste, and we start to give control to different parts of the system like we've never had before. So just a little food analogy to finish off. Thank you all so much. It's been great fun being with you all and with the great audience. So Thank you.
Thank you very much.